Chlöe Swarbrick.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is talking a heck of a lot about growth, and I got to say he knows a little bit about it because his government is knowingly making decisions to grow climate-changing emissions. It is knowingly making decisions to grow inequality, poverty, homelessness, and notably, record numbers of New Zealanders leaving this country. Mr. Speaker, the fundamental question in a commencement speech like this should be, what's the point of government? I mean it. What's the point of government, the Right Honourable Winston Peters? Government is supposed to make the best possible decisions on behalf of the welfare of everybody in the country. It is supposed to be about ensuring that everybody gets access to what they need, not only to survive, but to thrive. It is supposed to be about making long-term decisions on behalf of all of us. That is right now and into the future. It is supposed to be about protecting the vital, fragile ecosystem necessary for life as we know it. The point of government is to look after this thing that we call the social contract, to ensure the rules that we put in place to govern our relationships with each other and the planet that we live on are fair and good. The point of government is to organise us and create the things that all of us can only create when we work together. That is what makes a nation, Mr. Speaker, working together in pursuit of our shared values. That is where the idea of public services and fundamental human rights come from. Everyone in Aotearoa, New Zealand is entitled, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, to housing, healthcare, education, a clean environment and a stable climate. And it is the job of government to ensure that everybody gets those things. And I mean everybody. No one, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, is actually entitled to make a profit. But everyone is entitled to their basic human rights, to a roof over their head, to kai on the table and to access to basic opportunities. But enter stage right, the cost of living and the decline of democracy. The connection between these two things, Mr. Speaker, is, I think, important to understand. Because it's actually a pretty wild idea when you think about it, this notion of the cost of living. The idea that from the moment that you are born, there is an immediate life sentence financial cost to your life. 200 years ago, there was no concept of the idea of the cost of living in Aotearoa. There was no idea of private ownership here. There was no notion of profit. The founding agreements of this nation, Te Tiriti o Waitangi me he whakaputanga, were governance arrangements. They promised that everyone on this whenua would be looked after. But then, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, came the dishonouring, the slow and the winding process of privatisation. Over time, fewer and fewer people owned more and more of the resources at the expense of everyone and everything else. And Mr. Speaker, today, in this country, 311 households hold more wealth combined than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders. That inequality and that impoverishment and that theft of human potential didn't just happen naturally, Mr. Speaker. It happened because of government's decisions to privatise profit at the cost of people and planet. Government decisions which have those at the top have fought their way to that place to pile and hoard all of that wealth at the expense of everybody else and the fraying social contract under immense pressure to hold our country together. The government, Mr. Speaker, wants New Zealanders to think that the only way that things will improve for them and for their whānau is if they too mercilessly fight their way to the top. But Mr. Speaker, New Zealanders need to know that that is just not true. Because if every single year The rules of this game and this thing that we call the economy see 90% of people worse off, while 10% of people claw their way to the top. I think we should change the game. Because it's not just a game, Mr. Speaker. It happens that that is our lives. And privatisation means that basic needs will cost more. That is because the same basic things, whether it be housing, healthcare or education, they're still needed. But now, New Zealanders will also be paying for a profit in shareholder dividends and fat CEO bonuses. Privatisation not only means higher costs of living, but a lower quality of life. And New Zealanders do not want to live to work. Privatisation, Mr. Speaker, is precisely that death sentence that the government would like to take us down. And in November last year, as this House debated the Treaty Principles Bill, I said that capitalism needs colonisation. This insatiable economic system needs new frontiers to constantly assimilate and exploit. And as it happens, the same guy who is doing his best to currently tell everybody in this country that Māori are apparently coming to take more and more rights is the same guy who is trying to sell off New Zealanders' rights to access public health care. And that's just the start. Public ownership protects the dignity of everyone, especially those who can least afford it. Privatisation, Mr. Speaker, means that if you can't afford it, you don't get it. It literally means that people who cannot afford their medicine die. Once upon a time, not all too long ago, everything, the land that produces our food, the resources that go into what we eat and what we drink and what we use, well, they weren't divvied up. And they didn't have fences around them and they weren't owned in such a way that those who couldn't afford it didn't get access to it. The very idea of the cost of living came from privatisation. When we privatise healthcare, when we privatise housing, education and energy, you end up paying more to access those things. And if you can't pay, you don't access those things. And in October of last year, I asked the Prime Minister about whether his government was intentionally starving public services of the investment that they need in order to sow the seeds of privatisation. Government members laughed at me. The Prime Minister accused me of conspiracy theories and the current and the incoming Deputy Prime Ministers joined in. Now, he's telling us that he's going to take privatisation to the next election, which means that this government right now is currently managing our country's assets and well-being with a mind to selling those things off in the not-too-distant future. Just think about the former national government's decision to ignore an overwhelming public referendum not to sell public assets. And more than a decade ago, that national government sold off parts of our electricity sector against the wishes of the public. And today, we all pay the price of underinvested infrastructure and a manufactured electricity crisis powered by fossil fuel dependency every single winter in order for us to keep shareholder returns high. Now let's look at just what the Prime Minister is saying. Last week, he told everybody in his State of the Nation speech about his plans to, and I quote, roll out the red carpet for international investment in key infrastructure like transport and energy. This government has decided to cut public services to the bone to pay for landlord and tobacco tax cuts, and now it's becoming crystal clear that this government has no real interest whatsoever in investing in or building or growing our public services or infrastructure. Instead, they want it to be bought, built and owned by major foreign corporations, foreign governments, billionaires or hedge funds. And Mr. Speaker, that story does not end well for the little guy. The government is currently actively and openly asking the world's richest people to build and own the public services that all of us ultimately rely on because they are refusing to tax rich people fairly to maintain the services and the assets that we all rely on. Christopher Luxon's government doesn't want to govern. They want to farm out accountability. They want to sell it off. And Mr. Speaker, if we privatise our healthcare system, the government will no longer be responsible for those wait lists. They will have sold off that responsibility. And then we'll all be told that that responsibility is far too expensive to buy back because the corporations making exorbitant profit by charging whatever they want will charge far too much. And Mr. Speaker, one of the greatest fibs that those proponents of privatisation tell us is that somehow it'll cost us, the people of this country, less. But I ask people just to look at the United States of America, where the government spends over 16% of GDP on an almost fully privatised healthcare system, compared to around 10% for most OECD countries. Meanwhile, Americans get comparatively lower lifespans and much poorer health outcomes, while corporations rake in astronomical profit. Under privatisation, the value of human life decreases. But it's not just about human life, it's about all life. The Prime Minister wants to privatise our conservation estate and our seabed for mining companies' profits. This government is more interested in the rights of corporations than the rights of its citizens. But public services aren't just nice-to-haves, they are the necessities of life. Public ownership means that everybody gets what we need because we all collectively pay for it. And the job of the government is to manage our collective dreams. New Zealanders do not dream of lining the pockets of offshore multinational corporations and billionaires. We dream of spending enough time with our whānau, of doing the things that we love and of getting out into nature. We do not dream of living in order to work. We do not dream of fruitless competition and exhausting ourselves into the ground. We dream of things, Mr. Shane Jones, that are actually pretty basic. That is everybody's human rights being upheld. Everybody having housing and healthcare and decent work. But privatisation, Mr. Speaker, takes away those rights. The building up of our public services, however, is the best way to protect those rights. And we need to have that here at home. The wealthiest 311 households, who hold more wealth than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders, pay an effective tax rate less than half of the average New Zealander. What that means is that the multi-millionaires and billionaires pay half the effective tax rate of our nurses, our teachers, our midwives, our farmers, and our firefighters. And the government knows this. In fact, actually, the last government knows it too, because they commissioned the report. But this government went a step further, and in its first month or so in the job, they removed the enabling legislation to report on the inequities of that very tax system. Nothing to see here. Don't worry. Not too long ago, one of the new ministers of Commerce and Consumer Affairs said in a debate in this very House, and I quote, "There is such a thing as legitimate tax avoidance." That was a member of this government stating on the public record that he knows, as this government knows, that we have set up the rules in this economy in such a way that if you can afford the right accountants and the right lawyers, you can afford to avoid paying your fair share. It's totally legal. But Mr. Speaker, what is legal is not always what is right. In fact, much of history over the last 100 years alone has been a fight for making what is right legal, to redistribute resources and power, to make the dream of democracy real. Privatisation erodes democracy. It takes away our shared resources and therefore our shared power, and it hands those resources and that power to a tiny few. And the consequences of that approach are clear. Those with a whole lot of money are doing their best to take over the media landscape and our politics and therefore our imagination. They do not want regular people to have the space to dream or the time to organise. In fact, the wealthiest in this world have made it pretty clear that they're setting their sights on colonising space while letting the planet burn. But building up our shared public resources strengthen that democracy. It gives all of us more control over what happens in our country and through public accountability. That is supposed to be the point of government. Aotearoa can and will be a country where we uphold te tiriti o Waitangi, where there are homes for everybody that are warm and dry and affordable, where we recognise housing as a human right, where we can run on 100% renewable energy, where everybody gets access to high quality education and healthcare, including dental, where everybody has a livable income that ensures their dignity, their security and their freedom. This is the Aotearoa where people and planet come first. This is the Aotearoa that we are working together to build. And more people, Mr. Speaker, I believe and I hear about when I talk to them out there in the real world, are realising that they are not crazy, but this system is crazy making. And the more people who realise that the failings in the system are not a personal failing, but in fact something which goes to the root core of the greed on which the system is built, the more and more New Zealanders will realise that they have an opportunity to step into their democratic power and change this system. We have seen that the impossible becomes possible when regular people organise and work together to make history. Civil rights, te tiriti rights, queer rights, women's rights and environmental rights did not come from nowhere, Mr. Shane Jones. Once upon a time we were told that they were entirely impossible. But when we organise, when regular people work together and find the things that unify us, regular people win. And the old guard, as has been well evidenced by the harping on from the government benches throughout this speech, are quaking in their boots. They want the little guys fighting, not organising. So, Mr. Speaker, when New Zealanders here spin about efficiency or progress this year, I want them to remember the only ones who win in that game are the wealthy and sorted. Everyone else is left to fight over scraps, but it does not have to be that way. At the end of last year, the Green Party released Te Ara Anamata, our alternative emissions reduction plan. And our plan outlines an economy that can support people and the planet instead of exploiting and exhausting both. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is a green jobs guarantee, planting native trees instead of pine, efficient public transport, sustainable food production, restoring our wetlands, designing our cities better, distributed and resilient renewable energy, real just transition plans led by local communities, and so much more. Te Ara Anamata offers a pathway to build a world in which we not only reduce the cost of living, but also improve the quality of life. And Mr. Speaker, in my final remarks, I just want to point out, this is Aotearoa. We do not want imported culture wars and the privatising of public services that in turn hurt and bankrupt our people. We want a government that honours te tiriti and ensures that we are all looked after, as was the promise in that founding governing agreement. And Mr. Speaker, we will work together in unshakable faith to make precisely that dream a reality. Mr. Speaker, my message to New Zealanders is to not let this government frustrate them to the point of disillusionment and switching off. Mr. Speaker, politics belongs to those who turn up. And in 2025, Aotearoa is going to turn up.